Kind. Thanks, Daniel. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Robert Fry, and I'm an alcoholic. Really, it's nice to be here with you guys. I appreciate that introduction from Daniel. I mean, it's funny to go back and think about that, but I did look like that at one time. Sort of wish I had my youthful vitality like I did when I got here. But I'm grateful for that. But I got a lot of long memories here from this group and I got sober in Wilson, North Carolina, and there were a lot of connections between my sponsor and the folks here. And so we would get drugged over here to meetings, and you guys would come do stuff for us out that way too. But my name is Robert Fry, and I'm an alcoholic. And my sobriety date is April 2nd, 1997. My home group is the Way of Life group, which is in Dunn, North Carolina. And so if you ever want to come see us, it's a Sunday night if you're ever in the Dunn area, which is right up there off I-95, north of Fayetteville, south of I-40. But we meet Sunday nights at 6 p.m. And we have a great little group there. We just started, my friend Ryan Nocap is here with me tonight. He came to support me, and I really appreciate that. He came down from the home group. But we have a good little group. It's a small group. We just started. We're coming up on our second anniversary. And we're doing the best we can to carry the message of Dunn, North Carolina. It's a small area. We don't get a tremendous amount of newcomers. But you can bet one comes through that door, they're getting worked over pretty good, you know. Like, if you're wondering why, as a newcomer, how they know you're new, well, we know you're new. We're watching, you know. And even in a group this size, the regular membership generally has a pretty good idea of who's been here before or not. And so we do the best we can because that's how we stay sober, is by trying to catch those new guys. That's the only reason we're there, is to try to be of service to alcoholics in our community. And so grateful for that. Grateful for NoCap support too, coming over here tonight. So, but it is. Anytime I drive over here, I can't stop to think about some of those early times when I was convinced when I got sober I would have no more fun. You know, I was a young man. The idea that I wouldn't be able to drink again for the rest of my life was horrible. You know, AA didn't look like much fun or much good as a brand newcomer to me. It was sort of the last place I had to go, but it's certainly was not what I was looking for. I mean, I can tell you, I didn't set out drinking as a 14-year-old kid to end up a few years later in Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, come on. So if anybody's new here tonight and you don't want to be here, that's okay. I mean, you might need to be here, but I didn't want to be here either. I can assure you of that. I was trying desperately to find a way to keep drinking and not hate myself and not hate the life I had and not get into so much trouble. That's really what I wanted, you know. That's if I just had to just be completely honest about it. But I don't think it was going to work out for me. I mean, my drinking continued to get worse to the point that I couldn't stand it. You know, that's other people couldn't stand my drinking for a lot longer. But it got that way for me too, you know, where I couldn't stand it either. And really didn't see a way out. And thank God I had been coming to some Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and that seed had been planted. The treatment center I was in Raleigh had AA members come into it and tell their stories. They would bring a panel of them in, and they would just sort of say, you know, kind of a brief little 10-minute talk each kind of thing. And that planted a seed for me. And the one thing I remember from that is those people said, I drank, you know, got in all this trouble drinking. Here's how I drank. I landed in AA. And I remember this, oddly enough, that they said they worked the steps and then they didn't want to drink anymore. And then a couple of them sort of had the same kind of message. I remember one lady and guy saying, because there were multiple panels they brought in over the month or two I was there, saying that she got sober and was good and happy and didn't want to drink, but their life got kind of crazy. And so she went back through the steps and her life got better. And I remember just thinking, maybe there's something to the steps. I really didn't even know what the steps were or what that meant. You know, we read the 12 steps at the beginning of this meeting, but in terms of what it meant to work them or to do them, I had no idea. You know, it just didn't make any sense to me. But it planted a seed for me that, you know, there was some help to be had somewhere when I ran out of ideas. I grew up in Wilson, North Carolina. I told you that's where I got sober. But you know, I think that happens for a lot of us. The reason I got sober in Wilson is because I drank my way out of my own home and my own ability to support myself, and was living back at Mom and Dad's house. You know, so that's a relatively common story in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was one of those alcoholics that would have just never had my own home or family to lose or career to lose. My drinking just was like shot out of a cannon. And I don't know why that is. I've met other alcoholics that was true for them as well. But I managed to destroy my life in about 5 years of drinking, which sounds absurd, really, quite frankly, that I couldn't manage to get my act together at that age to stop drinking or to at least manage my life, but I just couldn't. And I don't know why that was, but that's where I ended up, was back at Mom and Dad's house in Wilson. When I think back on my drinking, I come from very good parents. I mean, like hardworking, principled people. They're both passed away now, but they raised my brother and I, to know right from wrong, to tell the truth, about going to hard work, about trying to educate yourself, to try and help others. My brother and I were drugged to church seemingly every moment that my parents could, and I hated every moment of it. But there was nothing wrong with that kind of upbringing. They had anything I wanted. But for me, had a little bit of wine one night with dinner, and we didn't often drink in my house. My parents had this big cabinet or closet full of liquor bottles that people would give them as gifts, and they would buy for like making a rum cake or just a holiday party, and they would stash the rest of the vodka and the whiskey in the closet, and it sat there gathering dust seemingly. But we would occasionally have wine with dinner, and one of the most vivid memories I've got of the first time I got that feeling of what alcohol did for me was drinking red wine with my parents at the table. They let me have a glass of it. I guess I was 14 or 15 years old, and I didn't expect anything from it. It was kind of sour. You know, had that kind of bitter, sort of sour taste to it. And I had dinner. I managed to convince them to give me another glass of wine. And by the time I had that second one, all of a sudden things are starting to feel good. You know, and I wasn't necessarily expecting that. You know, my parents drank some, but I never saw them get drunk that I can hardly remember. And so I had never been around a lot of drunkenness, but I knew that made me feel good. And I like that. And I just had this intuitive thought. And again, I'm not here to diagnose my own alcoholism or even yours, but I seemed like I had an alcoholic mind from that first moment, because as I'm sitting at the dinner table with them, I had the intuitive thought, offer to put that bottle of wine away, and when you get around the corner, you can turn it up and get another glass out of that thing before anybody sees you doing it. Right off the bat. You know, I don't know why my mind was wired that way. It just was. Again, I had no reason to think like that, no reason to act like that, but that's exactly what I did. And I went on and chased that feeling. You know, I was a kid who grew up scared without any reason to be scared. There was no logical reason for me to have any fear in my life. I had great parents, great upbringing, safe household, all that stuff, but I was terrified of life. Always felt like I was coming from behind. If I'd been in a room like this, it would have seemed like to me, and I was convinced of this, that you guys all got about 5 minutes of instructions about what we were doing together that I didn't have. It's just what it felt like to me. And I don't think it certainly wasn't true. You know, I mean, I got by in school and life fine, but I just always had those kind of feelings. But that wine that night melted that stuff. And for some reason, I just knew that it would. It melted those feelings of inadequacy and fear and all that. And so I didn't go into problem drinking right away, but within the first year of me beginning to experiment with drinking, and I mentioned my parents' liquor closet earlier, and it became just an unlimited stash for me at the amount I was drinking at the time as a young teenager that I could get into. And so, again, here's another intuitive thought for me, and I'll kind of accelerate through my drinking here. But again, this is probably early high school. I'm sitting there thinking, you know, doing homework. I was a pretty good student, fairly studious. And I thought, you know, I'm drinking with my buddies on the weekends sometimes when my friends come over. Here I am doing my homework. You know what would make this homework better? Go get some whiskey out of there and mix it with some iced tea and sit here and sip on that while you do your homework. You know, again, nobody told me. I was not at a party. No one suggested I do that. But I just knew that it made me feel good. And I thought it made me smarter, really. There's no evidence of that. But really, I thought if it does that much for, you know, how I felt, it's got to be good for me. So that's what I did. So I started drinking during the week before, you know, I was ever really in trouble with my drinking. I just think I have an intuitive alcoholic mind. Doesn't really make sense, but it's just the way it was for me. So my drinking accelerated over the next few years. I began hanging out with a crowd that drank like I drank, and I began looking for people that drank more than I drank. And I got it. We'd go out on the weekends and get hammered. And I think for me, by the time I got out of high school, I was a full-blown alcoholic. Again, it's sort of hard to do. I was not legally able to buy any alcohol, but nevertheless, I think I was becoming a full-blown alcoholic. This is the early to mid '90s, which seems like ancient history now. I can't believe I'm saying that, but it is. That's 30 years ago almost, or more. But back then, you know, there were always stores you could buy beer at. and you couldn't always buy liquor because that was at the ABC stores, and they were a fair bit more rigid about young men trying to go in there under 21 and buy bottles of vodka and stuff. But we could get older folks to buy it for us. But there was always beer you could always get almost anywhere in Wilson if you wanted to. So that's what I did, but I loved it. Again, it didn't cause me a lot of trouble. I mean, I had several years there where drinking was fine, and it was fun, and I could stop, and it wasn't something I had to do all the time. But I don't know exactly when I crossed the line. I think it was before I graduated high school. Drinking was no longer just for fun. You know, I was drinking to fall asleep at night. I was drinking because that fear was coming back. I was drinking because I was having trouble in relationships. You know, it was beginning to be more and more frequent. In fact, I didn't realize this. I was looking back a few years ago. I'd actually begun seeing psychiatrists in high school for depression and whatever else you might call it, anger issues and stuff like that. And I think that alcohol was beginning to turn my personality, and it was no longer working for me. And so that was just my experience. And so I had the idea that I could go off if I left Wilson, which was we were talking about this before the meeting. Wilson was the problem, right? Everybody hanging out with in Wilson. Let's move towns. And if you're a practicing alcoholic, that sounds like a fantastic idea. And I wish it would work out for us, but it just never seems to work out. But, you know, I blamed others for my drinking. I blamed others for the problems I had. And so I thought, you know, I'm graduating from high school. I'd like to go to college somewhere. Let me pick one of the furthest schools away from Wilson in the state. So I went to Appalachian State in Boone, which was at that time almost 4.5 hours away. It's a little easier to get there now because they've opened the roads up getting in there on 421 a fair bit from where they were back then. But I thought, man, the mountains would be new, you know, different environment, all that kind of stuff. And you guys know what happened. I mean, I hit Appalachian State University, and it was just, my drinking got so much worse. You know, it got so much worse than I could have ever imagined it, really. And but just a few months earlier, that was the solution, was to move. You know, to see new people, live in new places. And it didn't matter what town I would have moved to. I could have moved to Fayetteville. I could have moved to Dunn. I could have moved here to Southern Pines. I mean, I was gonna find that crowd. I was not at the end yet where I was looking for a way out, but I fell right in seemingly with the crowd that drank like I did. I didn't have to look very far there. Because, you know, colleges a lot of colleges, you know, having a good time and partying a lot and drinking a lot and that kind of thing. So I didn't have to look far, but I fell right in with a group of people. One of our friends from Wilson, who was a little bit older than us, who was buying us a fair bit of our alcohol, who'd been there a few years. In fact, I think was there. He never did graduate, but he was one of those kind of drunk characters that would just hang around. You know, just occasionally go back to school. And but he was over there. And so his place was right beside the campus. Like if you know where that is, where the dorms are there at Appalachian, you can be right beside it. And there's these apartments right there. And so his place was right there, and so we could just sneak out of the dorms and be drunk and then go, like, just like a block away is what it really was. And so we had these sort of, I don't know, call them entrance exams, but like placement tests and stuff. And I told you guys earlier that I felt like, you know, intellectually I was smarter if I was drunk and achieved a certain level of buzz, you know, like, again, no evidence of that. I just thought that was true. And so I thought, well, his name was Adam. I'll go to Adam's apartment over there and get my mind right and go take all those, you know, placement exams and really show him something. You know, that was what I thought. And I went over there and got so drunk I couldn't find where they were even doing the placement exams. You know, I did. I thought, you know, when you're drunk, you think you know where something is, and you start out to get there. I couldn't find it. I did eventually find it late, and they let me in, and I took those placement exams. I don't know what they were. I mean, I don't know how well I did at all. I didn't get placed in any kind of super smart classes or anything. But I just go in there reeking of whiskey and beer, but for me that was a normal. Like that didn't seem unusual to me. It seems very unusual to me now. And most normal people would think, what is wrong with you, you know? But that's what happened for me. And so I got what I was looking for. I just absolutely destroyed my life up there. I violated every principle I had. I began stealing from those around me. I began having the experience of, you know, because we lived in dorms at that time. And, you know, dorms you're just like being in a hotel sort of, but, you know, you can hear people getting up in the morning and like their alarm clocks are going off and there's the sound of people going into a shower and taking a shower and getting dressed, and then you can hear the doors open as they're leaving to go to class. And I would be up all night drunk again, hearing that kind of stuff going on in the morning and feeling like I didn't know how to do it anymore, which again is absurd. I mean, getting up to an alarm clock and getting yourself dressed and showered and going to class is not that hard to do. But if you're a practicing alcoholic and you're in the midst of that, it can seem impossible. And I remember, and so I would stay up day after day sometimes, and I would crash. I'd be up day after day again. And I would hear these people operating normally around me. And it was like I didn't know how to do that anymore. And I would wake up often at dinner time. If I passed out, it was after the sun came up. I passed out. I sleep all day. And I'm just vowing, to not do it again. I'm going to go to bed tonight, go to class tomorrow, because I was just always missing class over and over again. And that's exactly what I got. I mean, I literally left that school with no credits at all. I left there with the clothes on my back one day. I guess it was one day. It was such a very, very foggy period of time in my life. It was hard for me to really remember what was going on. But I fled the campus of Appalachian State, swearing that was my problem. I picked the wrong town to move to. I picked the wrong dorm to live in, all that stuff. So anyway, my parents didn't know what to do with me. I really didn't know what to do with myself, quite frankly. My drinking it was no longer working. I was full of fear. If I wasn't drunk, I wanted to be drunk. And I wasn't going to class. I was incapable of working. If I hadn't been living in a college environment, I would have been living out of a car, essentially. So I go back to mom and dad's house. They don't know what to do with me. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm blaming. I said, I'm mentally ill. I've got depression. I got schizophrenia. I was trying to just give all this reasons for why I was acting like the way I was and how I was drinking. And I'm lying to those psychiatrists about, the way I'm drinking, and none of it's getting any better. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so they eventually saw through some of the lies and some of the deceit that I was throwing their way. And I think, quite frankly, I was probably starting to really look for a way out from what I had, too. But, if you looked at my behavior, it did look like severe depression and schizophrenia and all those things. I mean, when you're in the last bit of your active alcoholism, you're completely dishonest. Your hours are weird. You're drunk half the time. You're hungover the other part of the time. And it was just a terrible way to live. And it certainly wasn't any fun at the end, I'll put it that way. Landed in a treatment center in Raleigh. I'm very grateful for that. That's why I mentioned that earlier, that they brought in those panels of AA members. Grateful for those members. In fact, we do that. Our group, we go into a little place there in Smithfield that we were until very recently, and did that same kind of little panel for people in there that are doing DWI classes. Some of them may not be ready for AA, but we're hoping to maybe plant a seed like they did for me when I was there, that there's a way out through the 12 steps in AA. So I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't think I could be an alcoholic. I just thought it was some other problem. I thought I could manage to get my behavior back together, and I just never could. I almost felt like the more I did, the worse it got. The more excuses I could make. And so I'm grateful for that treatment center. This was the fall of '96, I think, when I got checked into, or November of '96 when I got checked into the treatment center. I got out of there right at the end of December of '96. And grateful for that. I got dried out. I was never as drunk, habitually as I was when I entered there. But I did not immediately sober up. I mean, that was not my point of sobering up. I had a few more months of drinking before I finally got sober. But I'm grateful for that, because again, that was just, it settled my life down. It got me off a lot of stuff. It got my life a fair bit more regulated. I'm trying to be careful. I think we got some AA police in the crowd. I don't want to get a violation here by mentioning drugs too much, but helped me get off a fair bit of the drugs I was using at the time too. And I'm grateful for that. And I had to have this experience, and I'll just share this. And I've shared this in front of my sponsor, who perhaps is the most AA police there is. I love the guy, but we joke about him being the AA police and the tradition violations keeper or whatever, but this is just my experience. So I was young. I got out of that treatment center. I was 18 years old, and I thought, I can't be an alcoholic. It was all that other stuff, right? It was where I lived, it's all that other stuff. I'm going to drink only, and that's going to be I'll figure that out, right? And I thought that's what I was going to do. And so from December through April of '97, that's exactly what I set out to do. And it worked for about a month. I think I was able to confine my drinking to 2-week periods there, and really just on the weekends. And then pretty quickly, some of my buddies who had not been in treatment with me, but were also dropping out of college, because they were drinking like I was drinking, they start coming home in the spring, and they're wondering where I've been, because I've been in a treatment center and then hiding out at mom and dad's house is where I've been. And they start coming home, so I start hooking up with them, and my drinking just exploded wide open again. It wasn't the other stuff. It wasn't where I lived. It was no one else's fault for the way I was drinking. And I'll just tell this story, and I'll try to get sober here, maybe share a little bit of recovery stuff. But I'd stolen some Rolling Rock beer out of my father's fridge, and we were in Wilson, and so we drove this old beat up truck that I had over to Greenville, and I don't know what we did. Well, we went to Greenville for the night, drinking, or I think we just went to eat or do something. I don't know what we did, but came back, it's late in the evening. I'm leaving this house, and as best I can recall, it's a Friday night, and I leave the house, it's late in the evening, and this is out like east of Wilson, between Wilson and Greenville, which is still a pretty rural area. It's a lot more grown up now than it was, but still very rural. And there's a place called Stantonsburg out there, and I think Saratoga's out that way, little towns, little communities. But I was driving that car down, that big drunk truck down the road, and just pulled it, right off on the right side, and drove it down the ditch, cleaned the ditch out on that side, and then as I'm trying to get it back up on the road, it just completely spins around and flips, and then flipped across the road, pointing back the other direction. I can remember being pulled off the steering wheel. This was a 1986 Ford F-250, which is actually kind of a cool truck if you could restore something like that now. But I destroyed it is what I did with that accident. And so it flipped, just pointed back on the other side of the road. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I was drunk, and I really don't know what had happened. But, it happened so quickly. I was like, I didn't know what happened. But I'm laying there on the roof of this single cab truck, looking up. The CD player is still spinning, the Grateful Dead CD I've got in there. It's this green Pioneer. There used to be green and orange ones, and it would change colors. The engine's off and the blinker's blinking, there's like a blinking going on. And I thought, my God, I flipped this thing over, and I'm looking around, I don't know what's happened. And I realized I'm fine. I was completely fine. It rolled over and flipped and nothing wrong. A lot of people get killed in those kind of rollover accidents or kill other people in those rollover accidents. And that was not the first accident I'd had, but it scared me. And so I thought, I got to get out of here now. And I figured, worst comes to worst, I can walk back to town. I was not that far out of Wilson where I couldn't walk back to some civilization and try to get a ride from one of my buddies who had dropped out of Appalachian like I had. And, as luck or God, however you want to say it, if someone flips their car in your front yard, your first instinct is to call 911, right? That's what any reasonable person should do. Well, I get out of the truck and I'm in someone's front yard, or their front ditch of their yard. And, the game's up, I know I can't get out of there fast enough. And I don't know if you ever stood in the middle of the night in the country, you can hear the sirens from a long way off, and then you start to see the lights eventually too, and so here it comes, fire, ambulance, highway patrol, they're all there. And, it's over for me. To me, that was really my moment of surrender. It was not the worst of my drinking. The worst of my drinking had been 6 and 9 months before. I was destroyed by my drinking. I drank every single day before I got into that treatment center and just couldn't stand myself or life. So really my drinking was not quite as bad at that time, but it was the moment of clarity for me. I think Bill talks about having that in the big book, that sometimes we're given that moment of clarity where we can really see things. And I had that moment that if I kept drinking, I was going to get worse consequences than I did that night, or someone else would, or whatever it was. Because that was not the first time I'd been caught drinking and driving. I should have had a bunch of DWIs. I didn't. And so my ego and my self-righteousness thought, well, I'm special, right? The rules are fine for you guys, but I should always get a pass, right? I'm special. I'm different, and I'm dodging, And there were times, when I had some buddies getting major trouble with stuff that I didn't, that I walked on. And again, it just sort of built up that ego and that pride. But I just had the moment of clarity with that car wreck that was a lie. That if I kept drinking like this, I would eventually have all those consequences and all those things would happen to me. And so I made a vow to go back to that little AA group I'd been to. As luck would have it, it was an AA group a lot like this one. A little bit smaller than this. It was in Wilson. It was called the Principals Group of Wilson. It's no longer around. But the primary purpose group sort of took over for that, where Sandy and Mike McCourt, some of those folks are. They've got a good AA group going there now, but I stumbled into what was a very good AA group like this, that if you show up as a newcomer, the regular membership is watching for newcomers to come through the door. And so part of me is scared and doesn't want to talk to anybody. Part of me really wants help. I'm in that sort of conflicted state as a wild newcomer there. And I'm grateful that they didn't let me just hide in the back. If I would go get a cup of coffee and it felt like I would turn around from the coffee and they'd have like sponsorship pamphlets pointed at me with their phone numbers. Got a sponsor yet? Got a home group yet? Here's the meeting list. Here's the phone number list. They just wouldn't let me, because part of me just wanted to isolate, even though I was there, I still wanted to isolate. And some of the early trips I was taken on as a wild newcomer was right to this group, from Wilson, which is pretty decent drive, but I got to listen to so my sponsor and a bunch of other folks would drive over here, and I'd hear them talk and stuff like that, and it let me know that you could have a little bit of fun in sobriety too, that it wasn't just a complete dead end. So that was, but anyway, I went back to the AA group the next night, which was a Saturday night, as best I can recall, which was right around April 2nd, 1997. And I'd heard people talk about sponsors. I'd heard people talk about 12 steps. I sort of had an idea of what a sponsor was supposed to do, to be like a guide for your sobriety, is sort of maybe what I understood. But I knew after that car wreck, I said, I've got to do something except sit in the meetings. I liked the meetings. It made me feel good when I would go. But again, it wasn't keeping me sober. I was still drinking. But I knew I was missing the steps or sponsorship, whatever that was. And so that night of the wreck, I vowed that I would go ask one of those people in that group to be a sponsor for me. And, I was 19 years old at the time. Everybody in AA looked old. I mean, like everybody. People my age, I'm 48 years old now. I would have looked ancient by my own standards at that time. Because I thought, well, if I'm going to get sober, I'll need somebody young and hip like I was, and smoke Marlboro Red cigarettes and listen to the Grateful Dead and did the stuff I did, There might be a good AA member that fits that description. I don't doubt that necessarily. There just wasn't that one in Wilson, at that time. So I ended up picking a guy. I've had the same sponsor ever since. I don't know how this worked out. I mean, neither one of us have drank, and we've kept coming to AA. I guess that's great. Neither one of us has died either. I mean, you got to factor that in at least. But I've had the very same sponsor, since I came in. And he said, I said, Steve, I need some help. I wrecked my car last night. I'm in trouble. This is not working out for me. Not just coming to meetings. And he didn't say immediately, yes, I'm glad to help. He said, let's talk about it after the meeting. So I said, all right, let's do that. So we rode around downtown Wilson, his old. At that time, he had like a turquoise Nissan Altima, I think, at that time, a little four-door sedan. And he was living on, I looked at my old big book over there, and I actually had his address written down. That was my very first big book I brought with me tonight, on Marguerite Lane in Wilson. But we rode around, and I remember him asking me things like, what am I willing to do? What kind of help do you want? And I didn't really know. I mean, and I didn't realize that was the best way to come to AA. You really don't know. I didn't have any plan of what I wanted to do with AA. I just knew my stuff wasn't working. And I wasn't convinced AA was going to work either, quite frankly, but I was sort of running out of ideas. And he said, are you willing to go to any lengths? Are you willing to work the steps? And I just said yes. And so Steve was single at that time, and he lived in Wilson. And I'd been working a little bit of a labor job on a plant nursery there in Wilson, but I got laid off from that. So I had plenty of time to go to AA meetings and to meet my sponsor. And that's exactly what I needed to do. And if I look back now on my own sobriety and how it worked out, I made a lot of mistakes. I haven't always done the right thing, but I've always kept my sobriety first. And that has allowed me to make mistakes and to be a human and all that kind of stuff, and not drink and not even want to drink. And so we started reading the big book together, and I remember him saying that we were going to get together and read the big book. And again, I thought, well, maybe he thinks this is going to work, right? But I'm along for the program now. And what it was, I found myself. I thought I was too young to be an alcoholic. I had all these excuses of why I couldn't be. And he told me to look for the similarities in the big book, not the differences. And we read, some of the forewords, the doctor's opinion, Bill's story. And I can absolutely relate to all that stuff, and no matter what age I was. There was a time when I was sort of conflicted. I think I've gone between feeling like really prideful, like look at me, I got sober when I was 19, and then feeling horribly ashamed that I only drank until I was 19. Like I've had both of those experiences. And there have been people, well, I'm not blaming these people, but well-intentioned people almost sort of pat me on the head that I got sober when I was 19, as if that's how I wanted it to work out, you know? I mean, I just told you, I wish I could have kept drinking too. I mean, that was what my goal was to keep drinking and not getting in trouble. So I had to find, I think, you know, just like everything in life, I think we work the steps and we try to live a spiritual way of life and help others. Those spiritual principles, I think, sort of move in our life, even if you're not aware of it sometimes. Like I've gotten honesty moved with me like that. But the idea of finding, you know, being right-sized here, you know, because my ego is so big. You know, I think I'm better than everybody. I'm different. You know, the world owes me something. The rules are good for y'all, but not for me. Or I'm the worst thing ever, you know, and I'm horrible and I don't deserve anything. And I think we find middle ground on that. And just like with that, the idea about my getting sober, I mean, I didn't plan that. I don't deserve any credit for that, but nor am I ashamed of that anymore. It's just the way it worked out. I mean, the reality of it is I got here just like anybody else because I couldn't keep doing it anymore. I don't know why it ended up at that age for me. It doesn't make sense to me either, quite frankly. I can't explain why it would. Logically, it just doesn't make sense, but it's just my experience. And so I'm not special because I did that. I'm not any different. It's just the way it worked out. And I think the longer I stay sober and the older I get, the more bizarre that seems to me. Because I've got a child that's 19 now, and I've got a child that's 17 now. And I'm grateful neither one of them has done what I did at those ages. And my parents didn't deserve the stuff that I did to them. You know, I wrecked their cars, I stole from them. It was horrible. I mean, they just didn't deserve any of it. And unfortunately, my younger brother came along and then just blew it wide open for about another 15 years before he got sober. He's got sober in 2016. August of 2016, but again, good parents, you know, good folks. From where I came from, and I'm very grateful for that kind of upbringing. But yeah, I think the spiritual principles move in our life slowly like that. So I went on, and I never told my sponsor this until years and years later. But I was convinced that I didn't have any defects of character. Y'all would read step 4 about, you know, we list our defects of character, and you know, we ask God to help remove our shortcomings. I thought, I don't think I have any of that stuff. I really thought I didn't have any of that stuff. I was completely dishonest in everything I did. I mean, you know, a practicing alcoholic sort of has a certain level of dishonesty anyway. I mean, normal people don't understand how much we drink or why we drink. So you're going to lie about that just sort of as a matter of course. And of course I was lying about how much I was drinking. But I was lying about everything else too. You know, I mean, I'd lie about why I missed class, or lie why I couldn't hold a job, or lie why I got into a car accident, all that stuff. And so I think that stuff just begins to move slowly for us, you know. But I was so full of fear, I didn't know that you know, I think I knew what like anxiety was and being anxious, but I didn't understand fear. I didn't know that I was full of fear. I thought I was just anxious all the time or something. I made no connection to that. I'm not a particularly angry guy, but I certainly was angry at times. I'm absolutely a self-centered guy, completely and fundamentally self-centered and full of self-centered fear is sort of my experience with that stuff. And so Steve suggested we were going to do a 4-step together. I thought, well, yeah, I'll humor the guy, right? I'll go through there and see if I can find anything. You know? And thank God that the early AA members, or I guess we adopted some of this inventory stuff from the Oxford group and some of that stuff, that we were supposed to write down our inventory. You know, I read this stuff in the big book with my sponsor about resentments, fear, and relationships. Again, thinking it was like some sort of homework exercise, that it really didn't apply to me. And I went home and wrote, you know, off and on for a week or two. And again, still looking at it like a piece of homework, you know, as if I was some kind of intellectual, you know, I was a college dropout with no credit at all, you know, but I thought I knew something. So, but I did it. I was willing to write down what I thought were resentments for me. I wrote down, and I actually was beginning to discover I had a lot of fear. You know, I began to discover that, and certainly had trouble with relationships. And I remember for me, the connection was when I went to Steve's house out there on Marguerite Lane. I sat down with that big book and that pad of paper I had, or whatever I'd written it on, and it was like it just came alive for me. That was exactly what I was made up of. And until that moment, I didn't know that. But it's funny how those spiritual principles will move like that. And I didn't begin to understand all the fear and all the self-centeredness and all the resentment and all that stuff. But it was like the door cracked open to say, yeah, here's the beginning of this stuff for you. And so I read my 5th step to my sponsor at his house there. That was the beginning of it for me. I like to bring that old big book around. I just found it a few years ago because it has what I purported to be my original sobriety date in it. which I think is December 16th, 1996, which was the date I got out of that treatment center. And so I spent the next 10 months telling everybody I got sober December of 1996, when I had not. And, but that's what I mean about how honesty and spiritual principles move in our lives. Because I was in a delusion. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I didn't tell a lie. I was an absolute liar when I got sober and continue to lie about things. But my sobriety date was a delusion for me. I believed it too. And so I continued to tell everybody I got sober in December of 96, even though my sobriety date's April of 97. Because again, I was trying that experiment of, sort of the beer-only drinking experiment there until I had that car wreck. Well, again, I had the car wreck. I got responsibly sober after April of 97. I worked the steps that summer and was grateful to be sober and was happy, was living one day at a time, going to AA all the time. And I had a chance to go back to college. I'm very grateful for that. They let me back in. I had to go through and meet some of their psychological department and stuff because I was a hazard to that campus. I was not a good bet as a guy to let back in on a college campus. And so they did let me back in, and I got connected with AA members in the Boone area, and I got a home group in Blowing Rock, and I'm going to AA almost every night. It was just what I needed to do as a newcomer. I didn't like sitting at home at night. My mind would just sort of fire off with obsessive thoughts and fear or thoughts about drinking. So I went to AA almost every single night the first few years of my sobriety. But as I recall, I'm walking to class. I lived on the east side of the campus, and my math class was over on the west side. And as I'm walking to class one day, it's like a thunderbolt hit me. You've been lying about your sobriety date. Like it just hit me, and I was like, wait a second, is that right? I thought, I don't like that, but we're going to pretend like I didn't just have that thought, And this is how honesty moved for me. I mean, I was clearly being dishonest, but in terms of a conscious way, there was only about 3 days of it, because once that moment, that honesty pierced my outer shell or whatever it was, my brain, it wouldn't go away. It was like, you're going to have to get honest about this. And I'm thinking all the ways, I don't need, no one needs to know that, right? Who cares, right? Yeah, because I was really responsibly sober at that time, but I'd only been sober a few months by the time I went back to school. And as I recall, I spent the next 3 days every way I could rationalizing why I was not going to tell anybody about my sobriety being wrong. And I can tell you, I best I can recall, I came back from class just full of fear and obsession in my mind. I had to get that out, or it was going to take over. I was going to drink. I don't know whether I drank again, but I felt like I was losing my mind. And ran into the dorm. Back then, we still had the old pickup phones. We had to dial the number. And my sponsor, this is the middle of the week. He used to have weird kind of work hours where he worked, but he picked up the phone in the middle of whatever afternoon that was. It was during the week because I was coming back from class. And I said, Steve, I've been lying about my sobriety. And it just had to come out. And, those of us that have been sober a while, we're used to all that weirdness from newcomers, I mean, it's not that big a deal, really. Because I was not drinking at that time, but it was just one of those things I had to straighten out. And to me, it just proves that if we get into action with the steps, get into action with AA, a lot of that stuff takes care of itself sometimes, in terms of getting honest and how we live our lives. I think we need guidance. I certainly needed a good sponsor and to have that, but that's how that stuff moved for me. And so, honesty has gotten a lot more real for me over the years, but it started with that sort of major event, and very grateful for that kind of stuff. And I was just grateful to find that old book with that date written in it, because it's just part of my own personal AA history, of how that worked out. And I share that story because I know I've heard other people have had that experience, or maybe sitting on that experience, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, the months itself didn't matter at all. What mattered is I was actually participating as a good AA member at that time. I was responsibly sober about 6 months when I had to make that confession. So I had a really good experience. I was able to go back to college. As you guys probably know, Boone was not the problem. The dorm I lived in was not the problem. I literally went back and was able to live in the same environment and stay sober without having any trouble. I won't say it was completely easy. It was a dorm environment, which is difficult to live in sometimes. It's pretty close quarters with stuff, and some people would be partying and drinking in there, and it was weird, but it was never a temptation. It was irritating to me a little bit, but it was never a temptation for me, and I don't take any credit for that, like that I deserved it, but I was solidly in the place of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I wanted to stay sober one day at a time. I'm in there praying in the bathrooms of the dorms, have my little daily reflections in there, trying to sneak into the stairwells at night to read the big book, and all that kind of stuff. And are we willing to go to any length? Willing to go to any length. So I was doing that. But there were such good people that I met in there. The year before, I blamed everybody for my drinking, and I went back sober and had just a completely different experience, an entirely different experience. I didn't know the guy that I was going to be roommates with. His name is Joe. He lives in Australia now, but he ended up graduating in 4 years. We were in school together, and really good guy, just a normal guy. Went to college and took advantage of that opportunity and drank his way out of it. And so we had just a whole different experience. My sponsor, I like to tell this story because it's funny to me. I don't know whether it is to anybody else, but Steve came up and stayed in the dorms with us. Like, it just seems like the most bizarre thing I could ever say. Some of you don't appreciate how bizarre that is. Maybe you've got kids that are in college, but I don't know whether they're bringing, grown men to come stay in the university with them on the hall. But it was a great experience. He came and slept on our couch, I think if I was sponsoring a guy in college, I might get a hotel room and go up there. Because he was going to speak for me on Saturday night. But he came and stayed in the dorms. We had a great time. It was strange, but a great time. But he got to meet a lot of my friends on the hall. In fact, we packed up, because he was the Saturday night speaker there at the Boone, had a rotating intergroup meeting on Saturday nights. And each group got to pick a speaker on a certain night, a certain Saturday night. And I was a member of the Blowing Rock Promises group, and I want my sponsor to come up, And we did, and we packed 3 carloads of people from that hall I lived on to go hear him at the AA meeting up there. Like, just stuff you could have never imagined, So I got a whole bunch of college kids packed into the intergroup speaker meeting to hear my sponsor, who, by the way, is my age right now, who seemed like, an ancient grandfather at that time. I guess he would be almost exactly my age now. If you look at how he was 25 when he got sober, he would have been 48 or 50 at the time. But just really cool stuff like that I think are God things. I can't explain that kind of stuff. I just know that when I take the right actions, my friend Aaron likes to say that you never know what God can do with a little bit of right action. Whether it's making a phone call, whether it's deciding to go to that meeting, whether it's deciding that I'm finally going to ask that person to be a sponsor. For me, it was that I'm going to go to that meeting and ask that guy to be my sponsor. I can look back from that moment, and my life's gotten better ever since. I've had some tough times, but in terms of staying sober, it's gotten better, ever since that one little moment right after the car accident. So what looked like a horrible period of my life ended up being a really good thing. And so I was grateful for the AA community up there in Boone and Blowing Rock. Went to meetings almost every night. Met my wife up there. She was a regular person. We started dating up there, and then we got married right after we graduated in 2001. We've been married now. Our kids are almost going to be 20 and 18 here soon, so it's kind of exciting with how that works out. So, but we moved back down here in 2001, and we've been over in the Harnett County area, Angier, like you said, ever since then. I'm just real grateful for that. It'd be real easy to look around today and think, I really deserve what I've got. I've arrived, and it'd be really easy to forget. And I think it's why we continue to work with newcomers and continue to come to meetings like this to try to work with newcomers and to go into jails. I know Daniel goes into jails and or prisons, and some of you else might do too. And is to keep that fresh, because it'd be very easy to look around today and think, man, I really have arrived. Glad this is how it worked out for me. But I want to be grateful to God and Alcoholics Anonymous for the life I've got today, because I would not have it. I'm a guy who couldn't stand even 1 year of college, got no credits at all, unemployed, stealing, wrecking cars, getting in all kinds of trouble. And then I went back with Alcoholics Anonymous to God and had an entirely different experience. Went on, I went to law school. Law school is what brought me down to the Harnett County area. I went to Campbell there, and I graduated from there in 2004, and I've been practicing law with the same firm now for 22 years, which seems like too long for me even. I can't believe it's been that long, but I've got a life that I could not have imagined when I got sober. If I had even just an idea of what I wanted out of life, I would have way undersold myself. And it's not that my experience is any different. It's just my experience is that I've always come to Alcoholics Anonymous to try to take action. Life is hard. I've had some really weird times. We don't have time to get into all of it here, but it always sounds a lot more orderly, I think, when we're telling our story. But I've had times of deep, horrible fear that were really just sort of self-produced kind of stuff in my sobriety. I think the trap I get into sometimes is, I think, well, I've been sober too long to be afraid about that, right? Or I've been sober too long to be mad at that guy about that, or I've been, it's like I sort of am handicapping myself almost in a way. Like, whatever's going on, you got to talk to somebody about that stuff, whether it's fear or anger. I think trying to practice A's 12 steps and help others is a great way to live life, period. It makes us social with each other. We're trying to help others. Scientific studies have proven, getting out of yourself, volunteering, helping others. A's got that baked right in. I mean, that's the whole purpose of what we do, is we're social with each other. We have meetings with each other. We try to carry the message and help others. So I think that way of life, gives us a better spiritual basis than maybe your ordinary person off the street. But it doesn't make us immune from problems. And no one ever told me that. No one was like, but there was something in my mind. I'm kind of obsessive about stuff, and I thought, if I'm working a really good program, I'll never be afraid. That's what my mind told me. Or I'll never be mad, or I'll never tell a lie. And that's just not realistic. We're human beings. And so I ended up with some health problems that I was really, really trying to ignore for a while and didn't want to address. And it started out with some fear growing out of that. I literally had a horrible experience with anxiety and fear that I didn't know was possible in sobriety, and had a very, very dark period of months about 15 years ago. I'm thinking I'm sober too long. This can't be fear and anxiety. There's got to be something else wrong with me. And if you show up enough doctor's offices, say you're short of breath and your chest hurts, you're going to get big, full workups for heart attacks and, pulmonology appointments and all that kind of stuff. When a lot of it was just coming out of stuff I wasn't willing to talk about, fear kind of stuff that I thought I was sober too long to have, And so I'm grateful that I've moved past it. It doesn't mean I've figured all that stuff out. It just means I've had different experiences around fear and all that stuff too. So I'm grateful for my life and my family today. I'm grateful for my home group and the people that are around. I'm grateful for my wife. I don't think we give our families enough credit sometimes. When my kids were young, No Cap's got young kids now, and his wife is at home with them. And if she were not, he'd be having to figure out what to do with his kids, or they'd be running around the hallways here or something. But, my kids are older now, but I'm grateful for, the support that my wife has given me over the years too, in terms of allowing me to go out and do a lot of stuff in Alcoholics Anonymous. And she's never seen me drink, but she knows how crazy I can be sometimes too. And so I think she's always glad to see me go to Alcoholics Anonymous and stay here, I'll just finish up around this thought because this sort of means something to me a little bit in terms of my own spiritual journey. But I've struggled. It almost seems like the longer I'm sober, the more I struggle with the concept of God and a higher power. I believe, for me, the very first concept of a higher power that I felt, because I didn't come here looking for God or spiritual things. I just came here to run away from trouble. But when we would circle up and say the Lord's Prayer after the meeting, there almost seemed like a sense and a presence with that kind of stuff. And sometimes in the meetings, I'll get a sense of peace and ease with that. And in some ways, I feel like I've not made a tremendous amount of spiritual progress. But I think for me, if I just keep it grounded in trying to help others and a belief in a higher power without having to really put a good definition on it. I think I was ashamed of that for a long time. The more I tried to define that stuff, the harder it was for me. And the more I could just sort of let that go. And I pray to a God that I sometimes don't know what it is, but I'm willing to take that action and willing to meditate and willing to read A literature and try to help others. And maybe I'll eventually make some progress on that stuff too, but it seems to work so far even without having to sort of have all those answers on that stuff. And I'm grateful I don't have to have all the answers today. I think that was another big trap I got obsessively into, was thinking I need to know something. Once I've been sober a while, I got to have everybody's answer, including my own. And the reality is I need to be just as open and teachable with my sponsor and anybody else as I was when I got here. So it's something good to contemplate. So I think I'm coming up on the end of my talk here, and I really appreciate you guys listening to me tonight, and I appreciate you inviting me, Daniel. Thanks.